All right, today we are diving deep into a really fascinating ancient worldview, a world where the landscape itself, the mountains, the valleys, was a battleground. And I'm not just talking about armies clashing. This was a cosmic war between gods.
So here's a thought. What if the biggest battles in the Bible weren't really fought with swords and shields? What if all those military campaigns we read about were just the surface level stuff, a shadow of a much deeper, invisible conflict? What if the real war wasn't about political control at all, but for, cosmic real estate?
So let's talk about this war over geography. For the ancient Israelites, getting to the Promised Land wasn't the end of the story. Nope, it was actually the beginning of a whole new phase of the conflict. They saw their new home as a battlefield, and not just against, the Philistines or the Canaanites, but against cosmic powers, and the, shall we say, lingering presence of some very spooky enemy bloodlines.
Yeah, this was way more than just physical. It was a battle over cosmic geography. This wasn't just about armies clashing on a field. It was a spiritual struggle against other gods who were basically trying to steal worship away from Yahweh. And, get this, it was also a fight against the physical remnants of giant clans like the Anakim. These guys were thought to be the offspring of fallen divine beings, and some of them had actually survived the initial conquest. So this was a war for hearts and a war for land, all at the same time.
Okay, so if this is a war over cosmic real estate, how did Israel map out its own holy ground? Where were the front lines for Team Yahweh? Well, it all started by identifying these special places and even buildings that were seen as like intersections between heaven and earth. Think of them as divine embassies or heavenly headquarters right here on the ground. First up, you've got the tabernacle. Now, this was not just any old tent. This was a portable, mobile copy of heaven itself, of God's heavenly throne room. It was built from a divine blueprint, a pattern God showed to Moses up on the mountain. It was basically a mini-cosmos that traveled with the Israelites, making sure God's presence was right there with them, wherever they went.
Then, later on, the permanent temple in Jerusalem takes this whole idea and anchors it to one spot. And its design? It was meant to feel like a new Garden of Eden. Seriously. It was filled with these amazing carvings of flowers and palm trees and, of course, the cherubim. It was all designed to echo back to that original place where God dwelt with humanity. And where was this temple built? On Mount Zion. This spot became Israel's cosmic mountain. You see, in the ancient world, pretty much every major god was thought to rule from a cosmic mountain. It was their divine HQ. So for Israel, Zion was that place. It was the center of Yahweh's divine rule, right here on earth. But here's where it gets really interesting. Check out this line from Psalm 48. It calls Mount Zion, which, by the way, is a pretty small hill in the southern part of Israel, in the far north. Now, why on earth would it say that? That sounds like someone failed geography class, right? But it's not a mistake. Oh no, it's a direct challenge.
What you're seeing here is something called a polemic. It's basically a theological and literary slap in the face. See, the phrase, the heights of the north, was the well-known address for the cosmic mountain of the Canaanite god Baal. So what the psalmist is doing here is just straight up stealing that title and slapping it onto Yahweh's mountain. It's an incredible power move, basically declaring, hey, Baal, your mountain isn't the real center of the cosmos, ours is. All right, so if there was holy ground, you'd expect there to be unholy ground too, right? And this is where it gets crazy. The enemy's territory, these really sinister spots, gateways to the underworld, they weren't miles away in some distant land. They were located literally on the doorstep of God's holy mountain.
And this enemy presence was very, very real. I'm talking about remnants of those giant clans, the Rephaim, who are still hanging around. Think about Goliath and his brothers. They were descendants of these guys. The Philistine army would literally set up camp in a place called the Valley of the Rephaim, the Valley of the Giants. And on top of that, you had entire cities like Ashtaroth and Edrei that were known throughout the region as gateways to the underworld, places linked with rival gods and the spirits of the dead.
This comparison just perfectly captures the tension. Look at this. On one side, you've got Mount Zion, Yahweh's presence, heaven on earth. And then right next door, literally adjacent to Jerusalem, you have the Valley of Hinnom. This place was infamous for child sacrifice to the god Molech. It was seen as a gateway to the underworld. And its Hebrew name, Hinnom, well, that's where we get the word Gehenna, which became a New Testament term for hell. You've got the holy mountain right next to Hell Valley. Talk about a cosmic war in your own backyard.
So with this cosmic war raging, sometimes in their own backyard, getting a clear message from God was, a matter of life and death. This is where the prophets come in. But in a world full of competing spiritual voices, how could you tell who is a true prophet? Turns out there was one single litmus test, a non-negotiable requirement. Now, we have to be clear about what a prophet was. They weren't just some fortune teller reading tea leaves. A prophet was a spokesperson for God, an emissary who relayed messages from the divine realm to the human realm. You could almost think of them as God's ambassadors, operating right in the middle of a spiritual war zone.
So, back to that crucial question. How do you tell the real deal from a fake? The prophet Jeremiah lays out the litmus test perfectly. He asks, "Who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord?" And then he says, "But if they had stood in my counsel, then they would have proclaimed my words." That's it, right there. A true prophet had to have been present in Yahweh's divine council, his throne room, to get the message firsthand. No council meeting, no divine commission. Simple as that.
And when you start looking for this pattern, it is stunningly consistent. It's there from the very beginning. Adam, he's listening in on the council right there in Eden. Moses meets with Yahweh on the mountain, which is, the earthly throne room. Isaiah has that incredible vision of the Lord on his throne, surrounded by seraphim. Ezekiel gets his commission when the heavenly throne literally comes to him. The number one credential for speaking for God was a direct, personal encounter with God in his counsel.
But here's the thing. Even with true prophets, the nation of Israel, they ultimately failed in their mission. So God kicks off a new phase of the plan. This was a secret strategy, one that was hidden in plain sight, woven through the scriptures like a giant cryptic mosaic.
Now this might actually surprise you. There is not one single verse in the entire Old Testament that says the Messiah will come, die, and be resurrected. It's just not there. The plan was a puzzle. The profile of the Messiah was deliberately obscured, with the pieces scattered across different books, different stories, different genres. It was designed so that you could only really put it all together and understand it in hindsight.
And you can see how this puzzle builds when you look at these patterns. It's incredible, really. Look here, Adam, the entire nation of Israel, and the Davidic king. They're all called God's son, they're all called God's servant, they're all given a job to rule, but they all end up suffering in exile or even dying. And yet for each one, there's a clear hope of resurrection. So the whole messianic plan wasn't some brand new idea that came out of nowhere. It was the ultimate fulfillment of a pattern that God had been repeating over and over and over again.
So why hide it? Why make it a puzzle? Well, the Apostle Paul actually tells us why, straight up. He says that if the rulers of this age, and he means the cosmic powers, the enemy, if they had known the plan, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. It was divine misdirection. The success of the entire plan depended on the enemy being in the dark. If they'd known that the crucifixion was the very thing that would defeat them, there's no way they would have gone through with it. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought, doesn't it? This whole cosmic story, with its holy mountains and gateways to hell, its hidden patterns and divine misdirection, it suggests a totally different way of reading these ancient texts. It's an invitation to look deeper, to read between the lines. Because if a plan this important, this central to the entire story, could be hidden in plain sight, it just makes you wonder, what else might we be missing?